SurfWatch Labs recently released a threat intelligence report detailing cyber risk trends. They noted that cybercriminals have shifted their targets over the past year from focusing on credit card information at financial institutions to increasingly stealing personal information across a swath of industries. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with our own Adam Meyer, Chief Security Strategist at SurfWatch Labs, about the report, cyber risk trends, and what businesses need to do in order to stay ahead of cybercriminals. Thanks for joining us, Adam. The first question I had is, looking at the report that you guys put out, the amount of data collected by SurfWatch Labs around stolen personal information has essentially risen every single quarter for the last year and a half. And to me, that was one of the big takeaways from the report. Is that what stood out the most to you?
It was, but it's not shocking as well. I think it confirms a lot of what we've been observing over time, but actually looking at hard data with its measurement. So what a lot of people, and what I brief when I do speaking engagements mostly, is at the end of the day, cybercrime is a business. And a criminal will target any company that is a custodian of data that can be monetized, right? And PII is easily used to monetize. It's from straight sale on the black market or used for follow-on attacks. We're seeing a huge increase in PII being used, obviously, in the U.S.-based news, at least. All the IRS efforts going on with spear phishing attacks to compromise employee W-2s. They're using PII to craft those spear phishing attacks, and that builds that trust with the recipient who falls victim to it. As well as PII is used for authentication purposes. So all of us have banking, obviously, and when you call a bank or you're calling a service provider, the first thing they're going to ask you is confirm your date of birth, your last four of your social, things of that nature, and you're now able to authenticate over the phone to a help desk type of agent and then use that access for malicious intent. So it's not shocking that it's increasing constantly. It is a very valuable resource. It's that one data element. I'm talking PII in general, names, usernames, email addresses, employers, home address, social security numbers, all these identifiers that make you can be used in 20 different ways to conduct an attack. And it makes complete sense why we're seeing this trend come up. One thing that I always like to highlight as well, whether you're a large company or a small company or a medium-sized company, all of us are custodians of this data by nature of having employee records and customer records. And because of this, it needs to be protected, obviously. It's a high desired target.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on if you think businesses are protecting this data properly, because obviously there's, according to the report, there has been this big shift towards targeting this data. I mean, why are criminals targeting it? Is it because it's low-hanging fruit? Or, I mean, do you think there's other reasons behind that?
I think a lot of it, a majority of it actually, I should say, is corporate culture failures. I've run into too many organizations who still feel that they are not big enough to be a target, or they're not an industry that's large enough or specific enough to be considered a target. And they completely have their heads in the sands about what's really going on out there in the world. And so because of that culture, they're not applying robust risk management oversight of this issue. They're not applying resources to fix the issue, whether it's in the form of budget or people or process or technology. The biggest vulnerability we have, in my opinion, is outdated corporate culture. That is the biggest problem.
Just looking at the report, there was really a big shift. I guess I'm thinking back to 2014. It seemed like everyone was saying that was the year of the retail point of sale breach, and pretty much every big major breach revolved around point of sale. And then when we got to 2015, the first half of 2015, there were really hardly any major point of sale breach stories. And we saw a little bit in the second half, mostly tied to hotels. Just wondering what you attribute that shift to. Or is it that retailers and companies are getting better at protecting point of sale systems?
Well, I think yes, to a certain extent. So one analogy I always use when discussing this is something called the threat balloon. So if you took a partially inflated balloon, like water balloon, in your hand and you squeeze that balloon, you're applying pressure to one side. Obviously, the balloon is going to expand into the area that's not under constraint. And threats are doing the exact same thing. Once we apply resources to a given area and we make that area a harder target to penetrate, we're squeezing that balloon. That just means that the actors are going to shift to a more softer target that's not under constraint, not being closed down. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of retailers who are the reasons for point-of-sale vulnerability attacks had enough impact on their brand, their reputation, their bottom line, as well as EMV being rolled out. Obviously, we're not chip and pin like we should be. It's more chip and signature, which is a problem. But there's at least a motivation to a certain extent to move in that direction. You're making the infrastructure a harder target. So obviously, threat actors are going to migrate to other areas that are soft and weak and also more flexible, right? When you think about it, point-of-sale attacks, they leave artifacts and indicators that they were there. They have to navigate infrastructure to get those that data for later use. But when you look at it, and it's also more easily traceable after the fact, but when you look at PII, you and I have our PII all over the place. Our PII, and everybody listening to this podcast has it all over the place. It's at your bank. It's at your doctor. It's at your schools. It's at every resource or service provider that you do business with. If one of those are compromised and your PII is utilized or straight up sold on the black market, you don't know particularly where it originated from. It could be 20, 30 different locations. So it keeps a little bit of cloak and dagger ability there and makes it very, very hard to trace. So I think you'll see it's a combination of those two.
And another area that cybercriminals have really shifted to is ransomware and extortion. And to me, that kind of makes sense because that seems like the simplest way to make money is obviously just ask the victim, hey, give me some money. And, we've seen this trend continue. And, just the last month, there's an announcement about ransomware that's targeting Apple devices now and other developments with ransomware we keep seeing. So to me, this seems like a problem really over the last couple of years that just keeps getting worse and worse as time goes on. Just wondering your thoughts on this whole ransomware and extortion trend that we really saw surge in 2015.
I think we're going to see it carry through to 2016 easily. It works, right? Again, this is a business, and these actors are going to gravitate towards the process that gives them the largest return on their effort. If they could set up like ransomware bots and hit hundreds of thousands of endpoints with that ransomware, a certain percentage, a large percentage, is going to take effect. And out of that percentage, a certain portion of people are actually going to pay the ransom. And if they're using automation to conduct the attack, they don't have to have the moral issues like a typical type of criminal where you don't have to face the victim. You don't have to use a weapon, if you will. So there's a little bit more of a moral ease with doing this. You never see the victim. So you don't see the pain or the suffering that comes after the attack. So I think it's going to keep increasing, or it's going to be maintaining a elevated but steady state. Why? Because it works. Why would they shift? And it would be the next thing we have a problem with to get ahead of.
Yeah, it seems to me like that's a pretty easy problem to stop, though. I mean, don't you just really need to back up your system so that way if something does get encrypted, you can just, restore it to the information you had before? Is it really as simple of a solution as that?
It can be in many instances. It depends on the variant of the exploit. And past exploits with early crypto locker and things like that, it really encrypted drives that showed up as a drive on your directory. I use cloud storage. It doesn't show up as a drive at all. So, yeah, my local drive would be impacted, but my backup drive data is not. And so it's really a procedural type of thing that we have to follow. Additionally, in many cases, you have to have elevated privileges for things to execute, and those, something like local admin shouldn't even be present for your general user. So it's really looking at what's the process that these exploits are using to gain a presence like this, and then looking for those simple mitigating factors that can reduce your likelihood of being exploited with this. That's what intelligence does for us. It's showing what is the roads most traveled by an actor. And if we can put clarity on which roads they're traveling, you can then look at your internal operations and say, am I well defended on that road or am I not? Again, I'll tie back to the dated corporate culture that doesn't take this threat seriously and therefore is not putting that culture within the budget process or the conversations internally amongst executives that should be happening. That's our largest vulnerability. Nobody's really trying to solve this problem at the decision maker level. It's certainly down in the IT security practitioners, the engineers, those of us that work in the trenches on these things that's very passionate about it. But the organizations are falling down on being educating themselves on these issues until it's too late, and then all of a sudden magically the culture changes. But it shouldn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and a lot of these attacks seem pretty simple, at least on the surface. Like if we continue with the extortion topic that was in the report, another avenue of that is DDoS extortion. And it seems to me like that's probably maybe the simplest attack of all, because sometimes you don't even need to do an attack. You just threaten that you're going to do something, and people must be paying because we keep seeing these attacks again and again. You have any thoughts on DDoS extortion?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously there's anti-DDoS capabilities out there that you could procure and re-architect for. But you really have to look at what are the past extortion attempts being made. So, again, if I was in a CISO role again, I'd be looking at my industry. And actually, I'll be looking at all industries, and I'll be looking for the goals and motivations of what those actors are trying to accomplish. What brands and environments have they been targeting? What were they asking? Who paid it? Who didn't pay it? If they didn't pay it, who actually got hit? How hard did they get hit, and what was the traffic peaking out at? Well, what tools did they use? And then I would be looking internally at myself to say, well, okay, based on this analysis of intelligence, what is my likelihood of occurrence of receiving one of those extortion attempts? And then if I do, what is my response to this? And that's where in the press release for SurfWatch, I encourage everybody to go look at the report and read the press release. Until probably the past year, when I used to do incident response and breach response quite a bit, extortion wasn't really a conversation we had. It was every other type of attack out there, but it was not really a discussion around if we have an extortion attempt, how are we going to respond to this? What flexibility do we have to respond to this? Who do we need to bring into the conversation? You're now talking, the conversations have to happen between executive leadership, legal counsel, potentially law enforcement, any kind of group that would have a seat at the table if this was an extortion that was not cyber related, right? So you're now having to pre-plan for these types of things that typically IT departments who, own this problem, per se, haven't had those conversations before. And so now you have to start having these conversations. What are these scenarios? What are the roads most traveled? And then based on that assessment, what's our likelihood of occurrence? If we have any potential for this to happen, who would we bring around the table, right? If you get hit with an extortion attempt, you've got 12 hours to respond, and these actors are known to follow through on their threats. Who are you going to call, right? Who are you going to sit in the room and start having this response conversation? Now everybody's got to get educated on what the problem is. Different people have different technical backgrounds. You're likely going to have to spend a lot of wasted time while the clock's ticking, educating everybody on this stuff, and everybody's going to have a lot of indecision going on because they just don't understand it, and you're in a pressure cooker. So you have to add this type of thing to your I typically use both terms separate. They're separate functions to me. Incident response at the high level is your technical response to a given issue. So you're talking security operations, forensics, your typical IR defenders. Breach response is the decision-making side, right? It is how are we going to communicate with customers that they are the victims? How are we going to communicate with employees? How are we going to communicate with law enforcement? It's the business decision-making side about how to respond. It's breach response, and extortion needs to be added to that process.
The final area I wanted to get your opinion on is just basically kind of what's going on the dark web. I know SurfWatch Labs obviously monitors the dark web, and I know that you spend a good amount of time looking at that data when you work with our customers. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the whole cybercrime as a service aspect and just kind of what's going on the dark web in general. I mean, it always amazes me when I look at these dark web data that we have, how easy it is for cybercriminals to get these tools and how segmented everything has become. And it just seems like anyone can really become a criminal now. And to me, that seems like that's a huge issue and a huge change from what we've seen in the past. I don't know if I'm overblowing that aspect of it. Your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a good point, and I've got a two-part answer. So the first part is the dark web, or I'll just say the black market, whether it's a storefront or a forum or anything like that. The black market is a great resource to look at what is the typical state of the underground economy, if you will, right? You can see what's being bought and sold. You can see what prices they're generating. You can see the tempo and the supply and demand aspects of things, and you can use that information to compare against where would you fit in that, right? So if you are a custodian of a product that has high black market value, you obviously are going to probably be looked at as a potential target. You can also use that monitoring for kind of an early warning detection. So if you're monitoring that, such as through people like SurfWatch, obviously, and your product starts showing up or your brand starts showing up on the black market, you'll be notified that they're there. And that way you can theoretically, depending on how fast you are in responding to alerts and things like that, can reduce your monetary loss from the fraud, right? You can be engaged as early as possible looking at what's going on and shutting down the fraud before the losses start mounting up versus putting your head in the sand and waiting for that uncomfortable law enforcement phone call you'll get that says you've been owned, by the way, everything's out. The other part that I like to highlight too, and especially for anybody listening to this podcast, when I do user training, when I just do general training for the masses in the past, I always ask everybody, you hear about everything being stolen. They read the news. People aren't dumb. They know something's going on with cyber. Every Uber ride I take when I'm on travel, I tell people what I do, and everybody knows what's going on. And I always ask them, if you got a breach letter this year, and more and more people are getting the breach letter, and I would ask them, do you know where your data went? Like, why was it stolen in the first place? And they have no clue where it goes. They just know it was stolen. And when I start talking about how it works, people start being vigilant. They start understanding that they need to protect themselves. And that translates into better vigilance at work and at home, right? Because our work life and our home life are interconnected nowadays, right? And so the more they understand that where their personal data is going, how it is being used, and that there's a real world underground marketplace for this, they tend to be more vigilant. And that is going to be the best training you'll ever have over some kind of CBT, where I'm going to click through the slides as fast as I can to get back to my day. If you have more of that conversation with people and you use that in your training, that right there carries a good value to it. So I encourage everybody, even if you don't have a product or a brand that has a high black market value, if you will, you might not have much of a presence on there. Your PII certainly does, right? So you would want to use black market intelligence purely, if anything, as a training resource, because this is where this stuff goes most of the time. And we're not educating anybody on where it's going and why it's going there, and people just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over.
For the last question, wanted to get a little more of your thoughts on what businesses should be doing. Because obviously when a report like this comes out, you have a lot of interesting risk trends and you got some threat intelligence. And that's nice to have, but really at the end of the day, you want to know, well, what should we be doing about it? So is there any takeaways for businesses or companies about what they should be doing about these threats?
Yeah, from a pure cybercrime standpoint, not really getting into anything like IT infrastructure specific, but from a cybercrime standpoint, what everybody needs to understand is, again, regardless if you're small, medium, or large business, every single one of us is a custodian of something that can be monetized. And we need to put that thought process in place to go assess how much of custodianship we have, how much it's happening in your industry, how much it's happening against your customers, your suppliers, your partners, your competitors, and really put some effort forth in identifying how much of a likelihood you may have. And that's the start point. Because once you understand that and you're starting to affect the culture change at the top, you can then start doing your capability gaps down below in the infrastructure house and see where you need to apply resources.
And that'll do it for this week's Cyber Chat podcast. The Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by SurfWatch Labs. If you want to download the SurfWatch Labs cyber risk report we were talking about, you can find the link in the podcast description. SurfWatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out SurfWatch Labs' other podcast, the SurfWatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.